Drew, are you there?
Hey, Geddes, yeah, I'm here.
Can you try sharing the screen just to make sure everything works?
Yep, I just pulled it up. Do you see it?
Yep, hold on. Yeah, looks good. So our next speaker is Drew Jago. Drew is a research scientist at DeepMind in London. He completed his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, where he worked on problems in computer vision and computational neuroscience. Drew's broad research interests include computational models for perception and behavior. And related to this, his recent series of works on the perceiver model, which has received quite a lot of attention in the research community. And today he will discuss his latest work in this area on long context Anymodal generation with perceivers. Yeah, so take it away, Drew.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, thanks everyone for having me, and hopefully we get through this without technical hitches, so fingers crossed. So I'm going to be talking about basically recent work that we've been using, working on to extend Anymodal models that we've been working on in the context of perceivers to autoregressive modeling. And this is part of a broader program to basically try to build general purpose architectures that can be used with minimal fuss on as many domains as possible. And in the perceiver line of work, so we've been pushing in this direction, but you might ask why work on general purpose architectures at all? Many of the advances in computer vision and deep learning have come in particular from designing for specific domains. So why focus on the general case? We do know that domain-specific inductive bias engineering works, but it's a slow path to handling all of the data that we ultimately want to handle when we're building general-purpose artificial intelligence systems. And this includes a huge range of both labeled and unlabeled sensory perceptual modalities, and things like micro and macro scale observations from all areas of science. General-purpose architectures, if we develop them, give us a route to handling all of this data together, whether in the unimodal or in the multimodal setting. So perceivers are a family of attention-based architectures that avoid domain assumptions, but nonetheless produce excellent results. So we think this is a feasible strategy to try to pursue. For example, on ImageNet, with or without 2D convolutions or image-aware features, we can get near state-of-the-art results. On dense computer vision tasks like optical flow, we can get state-of-the-art results. And on multimodal domains, we know we can get very, very competitive results, including with less domain-specific pre-processing than in prior work. This generality applies even to the language domain, where transformers obviously are the benchmark models. So here we're able to break the quadratic bottleneck and even the sort of the linear scaling bottleneck that very large transformer models have, which allows us to perform excellently even directly at the byte level. So with avoiding tokenization altogether when dealing with language. But despite the success of earlier perceiver models, so this is perceiver and perceiver IO in particular, there are limitations. So the first major one is while they're faster and scale much better to large inputs than standard transformers, they're not as fast or as scalable as ResNets or other sort of domain-specific architectures. We've worked on this in the context of the hierarchical perceiver, which I won't be talking about in detail today, but I recommend you check out on arXiv if you're interested in learning more about how we do this. And the second major limitation of these earlier architectures is that they assume that outputs are generated independently of each other. This limits them to tasks like math language modeling, segmentation, or optical flow, where targets are basically independent of each other, but doesn't allow you to sort of use them on general settings, and this would include things like language modeling and control tasks. So why do we care about generation as an important sort of feature? This goes beyond just generating nice samples from individual modalities. The real power of generation is that it allows you to have to basically tackle any task using a single interface. This has been explored by several recent works, including some work from collaborators at DeepMind, which uses autoregressive modeling in the context of an architecture called the transframer to model a wide set of computer vision tasks with the same interface. So this is tasks including segmentation, view synthesis, and classification. And there's other really nice work from that's recently come out from folks at Google, led by Chen here, in this work called Pixtaseq. So basically uses an encoder-decoder autoregressive model to solve a huge variety of computer vision tasks, again, using a very, very simple shared interface. But a fundamental limitation of the most general methods we have for generative modeling, and these include transformers, is that they can only observe a few thousand steps of the past when making generation. But in real-world generation, we know that long-range structure is omnipresent, And this can take many, many forms. It can be quite subtle, like the motif that repeats between movements of a symphony, or it can be quite obvious, like the mirror symmetry that's present that's illustrated in the 2 points in this sort of toy illustration image. So when we're generating this red point, the way that things will actually happen in a typical image transformer is that we'll end up conditioning only on the recent context, and usually this is done in sort of a raster scan order. And this leads us to ignore many of the important dependencies. So when we're trying to predict what's actually present in this red patch, we're going to have to, introducing basically unneeded stochasticity, or making the model try to infer something that it could just read from the data directly. So our goal here is basically to increase the amount of context that models can have access to during generation, to allow it to just directly exploit the information that's present in the data to capture those dependencies instead of ignoring or approximating them. And the way that this works in the context of sort of a standard decoder-only transformer paradigm. So if you think about what a transformer does, is it processes the same number of tokens as the width of its self-attention stack. And so here this is shown as 3 tokens. And what this means is that as we make deeper and deeper architectures, we induce memory and compute requirements that grow quadratically with each layer of the network. So this in practice, the way that we get around this is we just use a small number of tokens, and we can't contextualize in the right amount of information. One way around this is to take the approach that Transformer XL takes, which is quite a successful way of doing this. And this applies a stop gradient to inputs that occur in the longer term past. So this method is helpful, and it does generally improve performance, but as we'll see, it only gets you so far. On the other hand, in Perceiver AR, we use a single cross-attend, and this is just the same strategy that's used in the other perceiver work, and we do it to map a much longer input sequence to a smaller number of latents. This enables us to train on much longer input contexts while using the same width for the self-attention stack as we would in a comparable transformer. As a result, the model can attend to a very, very long input sequence, but most of the model's compute and memory requirements, which are proportional to the width and number of self-attention layers, is independent of the sequence length. And so now I'll walk you through what this looks like in practice. So Perceiver AR takes an arbitrary sequence of input bytes or tokens. This is here illustrated with text here, but this could be tokens from any domain. It could be raw pixel channels. It could be raw waveforms of an audio. It can be basically anything. We then have an initial cross-attention, which produces 1 key and 1 value for each of these long context inputs. And unlike a standard transformer, we condition our queries only for the very last inputs. So in this illustration, we use 3 queries, but typically we use 1,024 queries for sequences up to around 100,000 token inputs. This cross-attention is masked, which allows us to query, allows each query to attend only to the keys and values that precede it in the sequence. So in this example, the query corresponding to big A can only attend to the keys for itself and all previous letters, but it's masked so it can't attend to the big R that follows it. The output of the cross attention at A is then transformed to produce a prediction of R. So the net result of this is a masking strategy that lets the latents, which are the output of the cross attention for each query, be autoregressively ordered. And the big takeaway from this is that the decoded outputs can then be piped back into the model so that we can produce subsequent outputs that have the right conditional generation structure. So we can basically model anything with a valid probabilistic decomposition of the input. Once we've mapped the inputs to latents, we can treat the latents like we would as inputs to a normal decoder-only transformer. And we use many, many layers of masked self-attention. Because this part of the architecture is very deep, it's the source of the bulk of the memory and compute requirements of the overall model. But because the number of latents is independent of the input size, its complexity is decoupled from the input. We decode the outputs of the model just as we would in a standard decoder-only transformer. And this model can be dropped essentially anywhere you have a decoder-only transformer, but allows it to handle much longer context lengths. So this is quite an easy thing to drop in if you already have a setup that has a decoder-only transformer supported in it. And we can see the practical consequences of this design by looking at the train time performance of transformers of a given context length, which is shown on the x-axis, and model depth, which is shown as the size of each point. Here we're measuring performance as the number, the compute requirements as the number of training steps per second in our code base on TPU v3 with a per device batch size of 1. Without additional performance optimization, a standard decoder-only transformer runs out of memory, even for very shallow networks when using context lengths above 2,000. And this is because of the quadratic memory requirements. But Transformer XL fares better. It gives a speed up at small context lengths, and it allows small models to be scaled up to inputs about 8,000 tokens. So this is quite a bit better. But because Perceiver AR effectively decouples the input length from depth, we can scale even very deep architectures to much longer context lengths. We're showing results here in real training time steps per second rather than theoretical flops, so these are practical numbers. We've successfully trained very deep Perceiver AR models on context lengths as high as about 100,000 tokens. And in practice, Perceiver AR obtains excellent results on a number of domains, including 64 by 64 ImageNet, which is a competitive density estimation benchmark. And so here we're actually modeling things at the channel level. So the actual input size is going to be 64 by 64 by 3, so about 12,000 elements that we're predicting in our sequence. And so unlike the reason this does better than prior autoregressive models is that we're able to contextualize the model on the entire input image that precedes each prediction we're making using a very deep architecture. And this even allows us to match state-of-the-art diffusion models, which of course by design are seeing the whole image for every prediction they're making. With the same architecture, we can also outperform previous state-of-the-art models on the Project Gutenberg dataset, which is a dataset of book-length texts, using similar context lengths to prior work. But interestingly here, we don't require any hand-designed sparsity or memory techniques to sort of get this context length at effective depth. The reason we actually restrict to relatively small context here is that we find the model overfits like crazy on Project Gutenberg. So Gutenberg contains only about 20,000 books, and as you increase the context length, you're basically decreasing the effective number of samples you have, because as you start getting bigger, each example stops being sort of a cropped version of the text and becomes the text itself. So because of this, it's difficult to judge exactly how much context is helping in sort of a book length setting here. But we'll return to some data that suggests that it is actually able to capture long range dependencies in text. Excuse me. So before we look at that, we just to give you kind of a proof of concept illustration that the model is able to exploit long contexts, we designed a very trivial synthetic mirrored copy task to see if the model was able to grab a very precise answer from a very long input sequences. And so the way that this works is we have a sequence of 2 to the 16, or about 65,000 input bytes, and these are randomly generated. We train the model to mirror this sequence. So it's trained to produce the byte at everything that comes after the input while looking back at everything that precedes it. This is a very simple algorithmic task, but it does involve reasoning over distances from 1 to 2 to the 17 minus 1, or about 130,000 bytes. And we find in practice that this model obtains 100% accuracy on lengths up to 2 to the 17. And it probably would work for longer contexts as well, but we didn't explore that. And just as a historical note to kind of give a sense of like how far we've come as a community in terms of modeling long sequences, the neural Turing machine and differentiable neural computer papers, which came about 5 to 6 years ago, showed perfect memorization results on sequences about 50 bytes in length. And so we've moved from 50 to about 130,000 in these 5 years. It's sort of an interesting aside. One of the cool things about long context is that it also gives us flexibility in how we model data. In autoregressive modeling, we have to choose a 1D order in which we're to generate outputs. And for data like images, it's not always clear what the right 1D sequence arrangement to use is. And so we usually end up choosing some arbitrary ordering, which maybe has good effects in practice, but can affect performance in unpredictable ways. Because we're using a long context, we have more flexibility in this respect. So in standard autoregressive modeling of images, we order things like this. So basically, we generate all of the color channels at a given position, and then we generate subsequent pixels in a raster scan order. This gives us a valid decomposition of the images, and the nice structure of this is that it's such that when we're looking at an individual pixel, we see the other color channels at that pixel we've already predicted, which gives us some spatial coherence, even if we have a relatively short context. But there are other ways to order an image. For example, we might want to predict the red channel first, then the green channel, and then the blue channel. This is a totally reasonable thing to do. But if you have a very short context, this will end up not allowing you to look at what's been produced at the same pixel that you're predicting unless you can look quite far in the past. So for short context lengths, you'll end up not remembering what you produced at a given spatial position when you're generating a new color channel that corresponds to this. So we can evaluate this quantitatively to give a sense of how much interaction we have between the exact sequence ordering that we use and the context length that we use. And in practice, we find that at small context lengths, so 1024 here, which is about a 16th of the total image, or sorry, about a 12th of the total image that we see, the standard ordering does well. So as measured by bits per dim, where lower is better. But the RGB ordering, where we produce first the red, then the green, then the blue image color maps, produces a dramatically worse performance. On the other hand, if we use a much larger input context, we exactly reproduce the results between the two ordering. And so this suggests that just using longer context is a strategy that's going to allow us to apply these methods out of the box to domains where we really don't know which order that we have to arrange things in. And so this removes one really unnecessary degree of freedom, which is a consequence of our models being quite small in terms of what they look at. On real data, such as music, we find that Perceiver AR generates samples with a very high level of long-term coherence and quality, while also quantitatively outperforming prior methods, such as the music transformer on the Meister dataset. So I wanted to highlight one interesting example here, just to give you an illustration of how well this does at long context modeling. So in the sample that I'm going to be playing, pay attention to how the motif, so the little melody that recurs through this, is varied over subsequent repetitions. Because the model uses a very long context, the model is able to keep track of what it's done before, which allows it to gradually develop the content, perhaps similar to how a human composer would first establish a theme and then vary it to draw the listener in over time. All right, so I'm going to play this sample. It looks like we have some crosstalk from another channel.
Excuse me, could you mute yourself?
Just a few steps of optimization, you get a model that's already producing completely wrong segmentation.
Drew, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Cool. Thanks. I was getting crosstalk from somebody else. All right, so we find the model, so that was some illustration on music. We have the same model if we look at what it generates on ImageNet. We find that it's able to produce coherent samples that are quite representative of the underlying ImageNet data, even without class conditioning. But like other autoregressive models, Perceiver AR is slow to sample. So a 64 by 64 image, so each of the RGB channels, takes around 10 minutes to produce a single image when the sampling is performed directly. We know that for autoregressive models, we can reduce sampling speed by caching, but there is a catch to this. Standard caching increases long-term dependencies at test time. This problem arises because the number of outputs is different than the number of inputs here. So I'm just going to illustrate this by walking through an example. Here we see step-by-step inference with no activation caching. This works, but it's slow. In this example, we're using 4 latents, and just like during train time, they slide along with the output and are masked to the final 4 positions. The problem is illustrated by the second row. By introducing caching, so reusing some computation that we've done at previous time steps in the generation process, we introduce dependencies on latents that are no longer active, but have already been used to compute latents that are active. So these are shown in red here. But let's follow through the activations of the letter C to see exactly what's going wrong here. So at time step T3, the activation for the second to last layer is fine, and it matches what we saw at training. But at time step T is 4, once we started sliding our 4 latents, we used the previously cached activations for C, but that activation was already sort of computed with past inputs that we wouldn't have seen at train time. So because we have this additional dependency that, that depends on something in the past that we didn't see, we end up introducing dependency structure that wasn't present at train time. And we find that in practice, as we let this roll out, it compounds over time, leading to newly calculated latents to end up with very long-term dependencies throughout the latent structure that they didn't see during training. So this leads, if you roll out a model for too long, it leads it to sort of collapse and produce bad results. The solution that we propose to this is to periodically reset the cached activation memory. So when the memory is full, we do a fresh forward pass of the model for the next position, which allows us for most time steps to reuse the computation, but occasionally to have to recompute exactly all the dependencies we need for one step. There is a trade-off here. If we were to do a full forward pass with all of the latents, we'd have to reset the memory again on the very next step. If instead we did a forward pass with only one latent, then we'd sacrifice most of the processing power for the position where we did the reset. So in our implementation, we make a compromise and use half the latents of reset steps. And we find this leads to results that are qualitatively indistinguishable from using just a naive sampling strategy, but producing much better runtime. So with this caching in place, we produce full samples in less than 5 minutes. And if we take these models and run them through an off-the-shelf super resolution model, we can very easily produce high-quality unconditional samples from ImageNet. To get a sense of how the parameter count and context length interact in this model, we ran a few experiments on the internal Google Books dataset, which contains about 5 million books, some of which contain about 1 million tokens. So they're very long context dependencies here, but we know that we're unlikely to overfit it because there are a lot of books. Because changing the size of the input cross-attention in this model doesn't add parameters, we can easily train models with the same parameter count, but increasing context. So each of these 3 models here, which attend to longer ranges of the input, have the same number of parameters, but they'll end up with more compute and obviously more context as we move to sort of the larger models. In practice, we find that at a given parameter count, more context is better. So here we're looking at log likelihood numbers, so lower is better. So we can see that the best results are produced at context length of about 16,000. So increasing context does better, but we do have a moderate increase in the compute requirements by doing this. So something to point out here is that because we've dissociated the context length from most of the compute, we can get a 16 times longer context length at only 80% of the speed. So it's quite a modest reduction in terms of the compute requirements. We can also compare to a well-tuned Transformer XL baseline to see how much compute is contributing to the improved performance with scale. And so what we do in practice here is we match compute as measured by steps per second on our real hardware to this Transformer XL model. And this is a sort of a well-tuned one that we know we can sort of trust the baseline performances here. And we see that even with being quite generous in terms of how we're matching, so each of the perceiver AR models that are shown here actually use less compute in terms of wall clock time than the comparable Transformer XL model. We find that we're able to get deeper models and we're able to use more context in practice, and this leads to better eval perplexity. So perplexity is a measure of likelihood, lower is better. And so in practice here, it looks like the best model is one that's relatively deep, but somewhere between 8 and 16K context. So this is evidence that context is actually really contributing to the performance gains here. Because perceiver AR decouples the input size from the compute requirements of the internals of the network, we can also change the compute requirements at eval time. And we can do this quite simply by increasing or decreasing the number of latents, which changes the compute per token without changing the overall context length of the model. So we're doing this in basically without changing the parameters at all, just changing the number of latents that we actively maintain while after doing the cross-attend. And this operation is a purely sort of non-parametric change. If we run the model with the same configuration used at training, so same compute that we saw at train time, we get results like this on ImageNet. These samples are generated unconditionally, and we do, again, see clear evidence that the model can capture diversity in the training data set and produce quite compelling likelihood results at a moderate compute cost. But if we reduce the number of latents and hence use less compute at test time, we produce samples more quickly, but at a lower quality. And interestingly, when we run in this regime, so using the small number of latents, 16 here, we produce qualitative and quantitative results that match pixel CNN, which was state-of-the-art on this data set a few years ago. So if you're familiar with the pixel CNN samples, they look almost indistinguishable from these. More surprisingly, we can also use this technique to increase the amount of compute that we use at test time. And we find that qualitative and quantitative results improve accordingly. We think this is a promising direction to explore to develop models that can be deployed in settings with different compute and quality requirements without requiring retraining. So for slightly better generative model samples, or for sort of for settings where we can't afford the compute that we use at train time for a forward pass. So to sum up, this line of work, by decoupling the context length from the amount of compute, while still allowing models that can be applied quite generically to many settings, we've basically produced models that can make you more insensitive to the ordering, which allows us to easily handle new modalities coming in. These same properties allow us to smoothly modify the compute requirements between training and testing time, which gives us more flexibility in how we deploy our models. And we, by using more context at reasonable scale, we're able to produce state-of-the-art results on a number of long context benchmarks, generation benchmarks, including in images, music, in both symbolic and audio domains, and books. One of our most interesting takeaways, I think, is that we this architecture, we tried a lot of more complicated things that ended up not working out, but a very simple version, this architecture that maintains all of these core properties, ends up being quite simple to implement, given a base decoder-only transformer. So if you're interested in learning more, the paper is going to be presented at ICML at the end of next month. It's also on arXiv, and you can learn more at any of the resources listed here. And so this work would not have been possible without the large group of fantastic collaborators here, and with folks both at DeepMind and at Google Research. And these folks have contributed both to Perceiver AR and to the development of the broader family of perceiver architectures, which we're hoping to make even more general and even more expressive in future work. So thanks everyone for listening, and I think we have some time for questions.
So let's start with the virtual questions first. So we have a question: how is the attention mask on the latents defined?
Yeah, so basically the way that we do this here is, so in terms of the cross attention mask, we align the latents with the sort of the very last inputs that we have for a given sort of cropped input. So they correspond to 1-to-1 between each of the targets. And this is how we're able to maintain the autoregressive ordering between them. So the latents themselves are sort of have a natural ordering because each one of them corresponds to one of the last outputs. And so for the self-attention mask that's applied after that cross-attention, it looks exactly like it would in a decoder-only transformer. So you basically have a purely causal mask.
Okay. Any in-person questions? We have one.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. And I have a question regarding generalization and overfitting. So I'm wondering, since you use more tokens and it increases model capacity, so have you observed the overfitting issue in low data region? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely we have. So generally, so maybe the most informative thing here would be the books data set. One of the surprising things that we found here, on the PG19, which is a sort of an open source public domain data set, has about 20,000 books, and we weren't expecting to overfit this because if you look at it just in terms of the raw number of tokens in the data set, which is usually how people analyze data set size in language, it's certainly it's in the millions to tens of millions of tokens. But we found that as the context length grew larger and larger, the models were overfitting more severely. And I think this is because if you think about what the model is actually seeing, what actually constitutes one example, as you make the context bigger, it stops being crops or individual sort of views on the input and starts being full examples. So I think really as we're making these models larger, we really do have to take quite seriously the idea that we just need to collect more data. So I think there are regularization can mitigate this to some extent, but these models are able to basically memorize anything that they're encountering. So the real strategy, I think, is better, ultimately better augmentation and more data if we can get it.
Okay, and let's combine the last two virtual questions. So how long does it take to train the model? And also, have you tried the model on high resolution inputs?
Yeah, so the largest versions of these models, so the ImageNet model that we trained ended up taking a couple of weeks on TPU v4 to train the entire thing. You can, if you don't want that, like the state-of-the-art quality, you can certainly train it for quicker. I will also say that we have not optimized these in terms of what they're using. So this is a Float 32 implementation. There's no remat here, so this is a very naive implementation of the model. You can improve that a lot with sort of standard tricks in the literature. And then with respect to higher resolution, we sort of set that aside here in the autoregressive modeling context, but we've explored this a lot in the hierarchical perceiver setting. So the trick there is basically to have sort of a nested hierarchy of cross-attention layers, which allows you to basically consistently obtain this sort of linear scaling at every layer. And by having sort of a grouping strategy in terms of how you structure those latents, you can further reduce the computational demands of any attention operation while preserving essentially all of the domain agnostic properties of these architectures. We're still figuring out the right way to combine these two strategies of sort of having general purpose autoregressive modeling or generative modeling with a very efficient large scale attention model. So hopefully we'll have something on that relatively soon.
Okay, one last quick question, I guess, if it's quick.
All right, yeah. So I see that you have had like long range context in the formal layers. I can see the pros of doing that, but do you have any comments on using the long range context at the later layers?
Yeah, so there are a number of ways to do this, I think, that are quite straightforward. So I will say we tried mid and late fusion versions of this architecture, where we took the cross attention and sort of placed it later on. That ended up not working particularly well, but I think there may be some details to get correct about doing this. I think encoder-decoder architectures that had that sort of structure would work very well. The other thing to explore here that we haven't had time to do properly, but I think could directly address what you're talking about, is hybridizing a model like this with something like Transformer XL, which is using longer context, especially at eval time, but doing so by stop gradienting, so relying on sort of scale activations in the past. So this method could be used to sort of extend the longer context to more and more layers of the architecture.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.